presenter is Amy Wagner, Water River Restoration Consultant and Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture from Iowa State University.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I want to talk to you about the work that my company does, and I also want to sort of clarify. I'll be stepping back and forth between hats today, both as a consultant, a small business in Iowa, a disadvantaged business enterprise and targeted small business, also as a faculty member, a tenured faculty member at Iowa State. You'll be seeing some of the products of the work that I do. I teach and research the same things that I do as a consultant. And I think that that has benefits for both sides, both the students that I teach in terms of keeping up to date, and also for the clients that I have in terms of keeping up to date with research literature. What I really pride myself on doing is having a number of experiences over my life that have come together to allow me to do this kind of work right now. And a couple of things about this slide. I believe that there's a time and a place for academic research, and there's another time in which we need licensed professionals with professional liability insurance. And most of what I'm going to show you today is not academic research, but practice, sometimes involving research. The other thing about this slide is that some of these activities have overlapped, but I'm pretty sure if we added them up, they would be more than 20 years. But I'm not counting, first of all. Basically, the reason we're here today, this is the reason that we're here today, and I think you have your head around that issue already. There's been a fundamental shift in the framework. Another way of thinking about this is that we just turned, in the last 10 or 15 years, everything has been turned upside down about how we deal with rivers and how we deal with storms on rivers, with damage on rivers, and habitat on rivers. And while that's kind of scary, it's also a pretty exciting time. I've been teaching the methods that you're going to see here today for about 7 years. The students in my classes are from all over the world. The one in this slide is from Lithuania, students from China, from South Korea, from Malaysia, from Thailand, and also quite a few from Iowa. And what they do is they come to school to learn about what's new and upcoming. And so those are the things that is a great pleasure for me to share with you today. This is an example. These projects were actually both constructed in the past 2 years. The one on the left is on campus, ISU campus. The one on the right is in Minnesota on Mud Creek. And both of these had a similar problem. Both had collapsing stream banks, both had very high stream banks. But the solution on the left was predominantly represented and heavily represented by a civil engineer. The one on the right, and a single discipline solution. And riprap toe to top of bank has been bashed around enough today. I don't need to do that anymore. I think most people understand that this solves nothing. This just causes more problems downstream. And the one on the right is a multidisciplinary approach, led by a hydrologist, including landscape architects like myself, also fisheries biologists like Mike Stuke that was here, prairie restoration people. All kinds of individuals working together toward this multidisciplinary solution. I want you to pay attention to that slide on the left. We're going to come back to that. And I also want you to look at those rocks, the riprap that has fallen down into the stream. And you're going to see those rocks again in just a minute as well. I'd like to show you a little bit about some research that I'm doing right now on the West Nishnabotna River. This image on the left, the pink is, this is land cover data from 2012, so last crop year, not this current one that we just finished. Everything pink is row crop, and every other color is greens are some kind of forest or grassland or wetland. And what you're seeing in the blue line is the 1980 channel of the river. The 2011 channel is shown in tan over the top. And what you can see, and the pink doesn't really read through in this particular projector, in this particular light, so that sort of middle color that's predominant is the row crop. And what you see is the channel moving, as channels do. The West Nishnabotna was channelized around beginning in about 1910, and it was incredibly straight. 100% of Pottawatomie County was straightened. And so what we have is the stream is still responding to that and continuing to move as rivers do. If you've not been on the West Nishnabotna, it has a very significant presence. The banks are 18 to 15 feet high. This image on the right is from that very same area. And what we know is that, as Ben said before, rivers move. And they move for lots of different reasons. They move up and down, they move back and forth. And while this, a little bit of meandering here and there seems to be like, oh, you know, sort of, that's not a lot of movement. I measured it personally from 1980 to today, and that river in Potawatomi County is 2.3 miles longer than it was. 2.3 miles longer in the time that I've basically been practicing as a landscape architect and been licensed. And this particular image, the map underneath, was the stream as it was surveyed in 1875 for the Andreas Atlas. The black line that's straight is the 1939 channel, still very straight as a product of the straightening that Jim Gillespie talked about. And the blue channel is what you see today. And what I think is really ironic is that the river in some of the very same places that had the most circuitous bends, again, have the most circuitous bends. And so a river like this, it's not so much about buffering. In fact, if I could just go back to this slide, it's not so much about what's buffering on the top of the banks. There's no kind of grass, neither native or any other kind that's going to hold that bank. Neither is there going to be any grass that grows down below. We want to use native grasses in every way that we can when we know they'll be successful. But we're well beyond that issue. And sometimes buffers are always good, but they're not always the only thing that we have to do for stream stabilization. So we know that this river is going to continue to do this very same thing. So a little bit about what I'm going to show you today. I'm going to show you the results of some stream assessment that I do, very different from the RASCO protocol that was mentioned earlier, and I'll make a very short discussion about that. I want to show you some small projects on urban streams that I've completed, and also a little bit about my research with vegetation and shear stress. So the goal that I have been working with clients is to develop resilient systems. I don't want to understand where the degradation is only, because where the degradation is on a stream is probably not the source of that problem. And it's a moving problem. And sometimes it's coming from downstream moving up, sometimes it's moving from up coming down, and sometimes it's moving literally across the banks and down into the channel. And depending on that source and the cause, the solution is very different. And I want to help my clients bring forth the most efficient, both in terms of economy and also outcome that reaches their other goals, which may have to do, largely have to do with water quality, and sometimes habitat, and often aquatic habitat. So the stream assessment protocol I use is different from RASCO in that RASCO was developed by the Iowa DNR, not by the Rivers program, but by the other guys, and somebody from DNR can help me out with which, if it's the watershed group. The protocol that I use, part of it comes from a Roskin method, and that's a method that has been internalized by 4 federal agencies, more than 10 states, and is used across the country. So when I have results from my inventory and analysis, that can then be plugged into a system that goes across in other places. And we can understand more about how rivers are going to change based on the form that they have and the conditions that they're exhibiting. So these are some of the things I'm looking at. This particular shot is of a gas main that is now exposed because the channel is down cutting and moving. We're not in the deep plus soils with John Thomas or names, but nevertheless had to be mitigated. Another thing that I look at in real extreme detail is stream bank erosion. So I'm taking all these measurements with every single instance of bank erosion that is at a severe rating. And what that helps me do is prioritize all of the degradation that's present, the channel processes and conditions, and it allows me to help prioritize what kinds of things need to be addressed by the client, whomever is the owner or the caretaker of those streams. I want to show you an example from one of my clients. This is from the city of Ames. And this is a comprehensive assessment. I've done this assessment twice for them, the first time in 2006 And then we had a large flood in 2010 you may have heard about. And then in 2011, I repeated it. And what was great about this is that they were able to use the before and after data that I had provided to get disaster relief funding from FEMA to make repairs, because they had quantitative assessment data and photographs of everything before the flood and then after it. Like I said, 41 miles, the city has a lot of responsibility and not an overexorbitant amount of resources. So they don't like to be surprised. Public Works wants to know that a problem is coming before it gets there. And that was one of the goals of what I did for them. I want to show you two examples of the results. This is from the South Skunk River. The segment that I assessed is producing about 7,000 tons of soil a year. This very squiggly section on the bottom that's orange is of particular concern. It's the most actively eroding section. It's also adjacent to one of their transmission mains, a sewer main that's transporting majority of the city's waste to the wastewater treatment plant. So a very serious concern. Another one up in the Ada Hayden watershed. This is a very small tributary. Again, the colors are not great. But this particular little tiny segment, the channel and low flow is not even as wide as the black section on one of these tables. It's a very small stream. It's producing at least 1,000 tons a year. This sediment will never get into the South Skunk or the Mississippi River because it's going right into the wetlands above Ada Hayden. So you can see the Ada Hayden reservoir on the right. You can see the wetlands, and you can see the patterns of deposition and erosion that have come down into those wetlands. And this is also the part of the afternoon where we get to exercise critical thinking. And I don't mean to, I'm just trying to lay it on the line as I have experienced it and I've learned about it, but not all wetlands reduce nutrients. This particular wetland has been monitored, all the wetlands at Ada Hayden have been monitored for groundwater. And this particular wetland is actually loading more phosphorus into Ada Hayden than it's coming into it. And so Ada Hayden, you probably all know kind of about Ada Hayden, but you may not know that 75% of the water in that lake is groundwater source. It's not surface runoff. So when we talk about nutrient reduction in wetlands and buffers and stream restoration, we don't always know that nutrients are being reduced until we monitor it and we know it. We know that those practices have good. We know that there are important things that are happening that make us healthier. But we can't always pinpoint that a practice is going to reduce something. It's just too complicated, and it usually is relative to the stratigraphy of the soil and geology that's underlying the situation. So AIDS is monitoring 8 locations right now. I'm using a really low-tech method, and there are much higher-tech methods available that if my practice was larger, we'd be using. But one of the methods they're using are simply stream bank pins that are installed and monitored 3 times a year to see how much an actual bank is moving, and then quantifying that for nutrient content based on this nutrient content of that particular soil, and also the weight to help determine how many tons per year is actually moving. And this is quite useful because an eroding stream bank, what looks like severe erosion to me might look really, really severe to you. Or what might look moderate to me might look very severe to you. And so in terms of meeting the public's need for information and also making responsible choices about funding, this is one of the things that they're doing to help further everyone's understanding. Now I want to switch to the academic role just for a second. I want to show you, this is Iowa State campus, and we're going to talk about watershed runoff, stormwater runoff. This is work that my students compiled over 3 years. They literally mapped every little part of what you see in a color by hand in terms of where the stormwater was actually going. And it's kind of complicated because this is all buildings and curbs and sidewalks. And so contours don't really, topography doesn't really talk to what's happening in all the pipes as well. But it's been mapped, and this map shows by color the drainage outlet that is draining into College Creek. And I'm going to draw your attention to this pink area. It's pink in reality. It's right here. Literally all of this part of campus comes down out of one box culvert into College Creek. And this is a huge amount of drainage, and it is an impervious area primarily. Everything red here is not infiltrating any water, and probably the grass areas are not infiltrating a lot either. But this is the channel just downstream of that box culvert. And This is just upstream of that rock slope that I showed you that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And what's happening is you have classic outside bend erosion. So the river is moving this way. The deepest part of the river is right next to that bank. Every time it rains, the stream comes up about 18 inches. So an inch of rain, and we're coming up 1.5 feet. And that constant pressure back and forth has just eroded and dissolved the toe, and then everything else above it is falling in. And I got thinking about this with all the training that I've done, both in graduate school and post-training in the last 4 years of my business startup. And I started to think, why are we not doing something about this right here with the students to the effect that we can? And so that's what we did. We started out I started out 3 years ago, and this is just a little description of the channel there. We think about the top is probably something like it looked like at one time. It got lower, the channel has gotten lower with increased stormwater runoff, then it widened, and now it's starting to stabilize the stage 4 and to deposit a little bit. And ideally, it would need a little floodplain at the bottom. And as Jim Stuke said this morning about actively integrating the floodplain in this particular case that he's talking about, the active floodplain, is this area here. Right? This old floodplain up on top is only used about every 50 years by College Creek. That's the only time there gets to be enough water in the channel, and it doesn't have a lot of function. This particular site has a very intact buffer, but the damage and the water is not coming through the buffer, it's coming from upstream. And so what we want to do is somehow shift the current, the fall weight of the stream, away from the bank and bring it more into the center, because we have the space in this channel, the width in that channel, to accommodate that. So with the help of the Rivers program staff at DNR, we designed and surveyed in the structures that you're going to see. They're very low-end, small material. The biggest rock is probably 500 pounds. It's what 2 or 3 guys can roll down a hill. And guys, I mean 20-year-olds, so that's pretty substantial. And we hand-placed it. I want you to notice the storm drain outfall. You can hardly see it, but there's a storm drain outfall right to the left of the green coat. And that's something that was eroding and causing some of these problems as well. So here's the first, and these are called J-hooks. They're also a Rosgan technique. Not that his techniques are the only ones or even always the correct ones to use, but this was the right tool for this place. And so this was 100% constructed by students at absolutely zero cost to the university. And essentially what happens is the J in the name, J-hook, the long end of tail of the J is here, going downstream, and then the hook of the J is here. And you can just see, barely see, I think there's one more stone on this side. And if you notice, when you're looking downstream, what's happening to the elevation of these rocks? They're going up, right? So how this works is it's not level, it's going up. So when water rises in the stream, and it starts to head over there because that's where it's always gone, and that's where the current is the deepest, it can't do that. It can't make it up, and it flips over here like a little tiny waterfall and heads back over. And so this is the end of the first one, and this was done in 2012. And what I want you to watch as evidence that these are working already is this area where my finger is just about reaching in here. And what you see there is no deposition, you see scour, right? And now I want to show you, this is actually after the second vein was built, and you're going to see it in just a minute, or the second J-hook. But this is the outfall of that storm drain after it was reconstructed by second-year students. And then native sedges, grasses, and forbs have been plugged into the cracks in the sides of it. So what you see already, even in this light, is a little bit of deposition, right? Right here. And that's the area that was scoured previously. So we know that the river is already moving that fall wave, or that deepest part, away from the outside bend. The idea is if we can move it away into the center for the whole stretch that's eroded, we then have solved 90% of the erosion problems on that stretch. So here's the second, you're looking up now upstream through that second J hook. And you can also see that the top height of that rock is about 2 feet. And that's about the year and a quarter, the 2-year return storm. And again, so we were limited here with absolutely no mechanical equipment on a larger stream. Even in a perfect situation on a stream this size, we would have used larger rock. But it's been incredibly successful, and you also can look up the stream now and begin to see the deposition that's happening. This fall, we constructed the 3rd one, and that will be all that's necessary for this particular reach. And with this, I hope to be the last project that I ever use rock on. And so there are a family of mink that live on campus along College Creek, and we see them feeding, we see them fishing, goofing around in the stream. And so this is kind of for them. This is their view of the J hook. I've also seen fish migrating right up through the break point between the rocks. And those particular rocks that you see right there are the exact same ones that you saw in the river that had fallen off that steep slope that was just downstream. The fact that they're in the river, they're causing more trouble. They've fallen off the slope because it's too steep and there's fabric underneath them, so they're not able to hold. So we just brought them to our work site and are using them to actually stabilize the channel. So just one last thing, I have some research going on also with vegetation in the channel relative to shear stress. There's been some talk about native grasses and the types of situations where those are most effective today. And as I said, we're really excited about using native grasses whenever we can. We also know that woody vegetation is going to provide us more resistance, slowing more current, and in some cases is also the only thing that's going to resist the shear stress. And not even all shrubs and trees will be able to resist that kind of shear stress. So this is long-term research that the City of Ames has funded through my company. It's something that they're going to be expanding in the next year, but we're beginning to understand more about what species can be planted into these areas that are degrading in order to avoid the very high-cost practices that you've seen done in other places today. So with this, I just want to suggest that from my experience, what's needed in Iowa is a major retooling. And I'm not sure that I would agree with Marty that all the pieces are perfectly in place to accomplish that. This is not the kind of work that I'm talking about, or that we're all talking about with regard to river restoration isn't agricultural engineering. It's not civil engineering. It's a combination hybrid between engineering, hydrology, and other design disciplines, and also biology. And there are a number of things that we need in Iowa that other states have that would help us be able to jumpstart that. I'm not convinced a statewide assessment of all rivers is where we would start. If it were my cactus yen, so to speak, I would probably go for developing standards that would help all of us design hydrology and to do appropriate engineering based on, for instance, regional discharge and runoff curves based on this particular region. I'd want to know more about vegetative responses and which sedges are going to be able to withstand these kind of flows, which grasses are going to be able to withstand these kinds of flows. And so I think of all of the agencies we have in the state, and everybody does have a contribution to make. The DNR River Program staff are the only ones that have begun to embrace this technology that everyone else has. And therefore, they have been a real strong ally of mine in terms of supporting the needs of my company from a technical standpoint, and also providing support to clients that I work with. So I appreciate again the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to many solutions that are different from the one you see in this particular image. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Anybody have any questions?
As a private company, what kind of permits and things do you have to do? Do you feel there's any excessive hoops you got to jump through to get projects like this off the ground?
I don't think there are any excessive hoops. They're the same hoops that any kind of permit, the same kind of permit that any other project would have to jump through. And I actually think the permits are probably a pretty good idea in terms of helping to steer projects that might be going in a direction that don't have multiple benefits to having multiple benefits.
Any other questions for Representative Wagner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have you, has any of your work involved soil and water conservation districts or Story County soil and water?
Yeah, you know, I was on the NRCS state staff for 9 years and have done a lot of work. I'm actually an assistant commissioner for Story County Soil and Water Conservation District. I've worked closely with them in a number of the outreach positions that I've held. So I'm not integrally active with what they do, but those districts are always a really important part of the work that has to be done.
So would you say that they, just making a generalization around the state, have they been taking a lead role and starting to look at these issues, or do you think more initiative needs to be taken for them to become a primary stakeholder?
Yeah, I don't know that, I don't have that sort of information, but I'm not seeing a lot of, it's been very slow starting for this kind of work to be accepted as an appropriate substitute for riprapping and other sorts of practices that have been around longer. So I think with more education, and that's something a state program could do as well. Funding could be not only for professionals to get started in understanding technical issues, because they probably need to get professional training, but also to build support and understanding what is river restoration. Because riprapping banks is not river restoration. That's something else. And a small amount of tow, or even a small amount of wood at the toe instead of rock, is probably much closer to what we would call river restoration. So there is definitely a need to provide more information.
Any other questions for the